I'd like to give a big shout out to my new Patreon members, Emmanuel Conejo, XAVX Raccoon, and X Lucius Lux. Thank you so much.
Welcome to the world of Tales from the Trip.
This past Friday, I came home from classes around 2:30 p.m. and found my younger, 18-year-old brother relaxing on the couch, watching Rick and Morty, and enjoying a bowl from his vaporizer. It was his spring break. I already had mine a couple weeks earlier, and he had convinced our parents to allow him to stay home while they drove to Orlando for their usual spring break vacation. I was tasked with watching over the house, dog, and cat, and making sure that my younger brother didn't get into any trouble. I was looking forward to smoking with him and possibly tripping with him without fear of being found out by our parents. We hadn't been very close until about a year ago. We mutually discovered that we both shared a penchant for smoking cannabis. Over the past year, we had bonded through smoking together, sharing music, and sharing our psychedelic experiences. We had tripped together twice before with DXM, once with MDMA, and once off of 3 tabs of 25B NBOMe. The NBOMe trip began nicely, but ended semi-badly as our parents found us obviously under the influence and began interrogating us concerning the drug. There were no adverse health effects. However, we were tripping quite intensely, and being interrogated is not an ideal setting for tripping. Our parents were quite upset. Despite our bad trip, we still enjoyed the psychedelic experience and looked forward to another more enjoyable one together. After arriving home from classes, I proposed the idea of tripping. He was on board and began messaging his friends for possible connections. One of his classmates, whom he had shared several classes with and casually talked to, said that he had 7 tabs of 25B NBOMe that he had been saving and was willing to share. The friend, who I shall refer to as Jay from here on out, arrived, and we dosed sublingually just after 5 p.m. The tabs were actually from the same sheet that we had used for our 3-tab trip that I referred to above, Monopoly game board blotter art. Since that last trip was a little too intense, we each settled for 2 tabs each, confident that we would have a satisfying, not underwhelming, but not overwhelming trip. I had actually tried 1 tab from the same batch a couple months before, and while it was a nice time, it was underwhelming compared to my previous 5 NBOMe experiences. Side note, this was Jay's 7th trip and probably my brother's 10th or so. He had more tripping experience than me. 30 minutes in, we had all swallowed our tabs, having experienced the usual horrible, metallic, chemical taste and numbing effect, and I felt the electric energy characteristic of NBOMes start to stimulate my mind and body. We vaporized a bowl of cannabis and puffed on my hookah, which contained a mix of tobacco and cannabis, in the garage, hoping that it would calm the speediness and intensify our visuals. 50 minutes in, the hookah wasn't all that pleasant, and the disco-type lights we had in the garage were a little overstimulating, so we decided to step inside and listen to music in our family room. At this point, it was difficult figuring out the stereo system, and we weren't talking very much. I think that we were all being hit pretty hard by the NBOMe, making communication difficult. My memory of the next few hours are quite hazy and blurred together. I remember that the visuals were very strong and beautiful. I remember Jay asking several times what we liked to do while tripping. He repeatedly tried to initiate some sort of activity, whether that was music listening or playing video games. He must have been bored, but I was quite content admiring the visuals and getting lost in my own head. I remember stepping outside into the backyard and admiring the beautiful, sunny evening. I remember attempting to play Primus's Jerry Was a Race Car Driver on Rock Band with my electronic drum kit and failing, quite pathetically, a song I've gold starred on Expert. I remember sitting in the family room and seeing my brother stumble around and fall over. Now, this is where I should have noticed something odd, but I was heavily under the influence and lost in my own thoughts. I wrote it off as him tripping hard, or perhaps being silly. I was stuck in my own head, experiencing thought loops where random people's names would repeatedly pop up, along with visualizing Newtonian physics and molecules, amongst many other odd physical effects. I recall sitting on the toilet, simply zoning out for what seemed like quite a while. There is a vague memory of Jay and my brother coming into the bathroom with me and staring in the mirror. My brother had a bit of a crazed, confused look and coloration on his face, which in retrospect must have been a little bit of blood. Next thing I know, I'm upstairs in my own room, starting to come down. The time must have been around 9 p.m., 4 hours after dosing. I tried lying down in bed as I was quite exhausted, but then I remembered my brother and Jay. For some reason, I felt very apprehensive about going downstairs to check on them. I was feeling creepy vibes and remember having morbid, negative thoughts. However, I ventured downstairs and saw broken glass all over the kitchen floor. I was very confused and extremely worried. I saw that the front room window blinds were still open and a mess, as if someone had run their hands up and down them. I quickly fixed the blinds and tiptoed over the glass into the kitchen. What I saw next may haunt me for the rest of my life. I saw my brother lying on his back in the family room, with vomit trails down either side of his mouth. My stomach immediately dropped. Had everyone's worst nightmare become a reality? I turned him over onto his side. He wasn't breathing. His face was gray, and his lips were blue. I looked over and saw Jay lying face down about 10 feet over, probably lost in his own thoughts. I screamed my brother's name, hearing my voice as I'd never heard it before. I frantically searched around for the nearest phone and dialed 911. The lady on the phone recorded my address, said help was on the way, and instructed me to perform chest compressions. Having been certified in CPR, I placed the palms of my hand on the center of his chest and began forcefully compressing to the beat of the Bee Gees' "Stayin' Alive." Deep down, I had very little hope. He looked like he had been lying there without oxygen for at least half an hour to 45 minutes. The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. He began applying chest compressions, then ripped open my brother's shirt and attached the electrodes from the defibrillator. Jay, meanwhile, had risen to a seated position and still seemed to be under the influence. He didn't say anything and displayed no sense of urgency. Feeling helpless, I watched in horror as the paramedic continued chest compressions. He uttered under his breath, "Shit, he's bleeding," as blood began to seep out of my brother's mouth. I could not believe what I was seeing. Eventually, about 25 cops, firefighters, and paramedics had poured into the house while a team of people continued to attempt to resuscitate my brother. Not being cooperative, Jay was placed in cuffs and held down by a police officer. Jay still wouldn't speak except for a few high-pitched shrieks while resisting the officer's restraint. Officer sat me down out of view from my brother and began asking me all sorts of questions. I informed them of what we had taken, not wanting to withhold information that could save my brother. After an excruciating, anxiety-ridden 20 minutes, my brother was carted off on a stretcher into an ambulance. The other personnel had done the same thing with Jay. Utterly shocked at the events that had just transpired and fearing the worst, I was escorted into an ambulance of my own. Upon arriving at the hospital, I received the news that I had most feared. They had failed to bring my brother back. All I could do was sit down in shock. What was supposed to be a fun bonding experience with my brother had turned into our last moments together. I feel such horrible guilt and responsibility for my brother's death. I knew the dangers of NBOMe with its higher potential for overdose and problems with vasoconstriction. I falsely assumed that we would be safe since my brother and I had taken 3 tabs from the same batch before with no adverse health effects. We had even stepped down the dosage from last time. My greatest worry was a psychological crisis or someone leaving the house, not death. I did not know of all the seizures and heart issues that others have experienced with the NBOMe series. I believed that my brother had a seizure and choked on his own vomit. However, the coroner stated that he had experienced an arrhythmia, which led to cardiac arrest and thus death. At the very least, I wish I could have known what had happened in those last moments. I wish I could have been there, lucid and ready to call for help. The house downstairs looked as if Motley Crue had destroyed the place in a drug-fueled frenzy. I imagined my brother was losing consciousness, stumbling and falling, trying to make sense of what was going on. He had minor lacerations, cuts, and abrasions from the glass, and contusions on his head, arms, and legs. I hope with all of my heart that he was not suffering in his last moments. I like to think that he was having the trip of a lifetime. Perhaps he talked to God. Maybe he saw the light. I have no idea if there is an afterlife, as I am not religious, and neither was my brother. But if there is, I hope he's in a peaceful place. He was the most kind-hearted, loving, carefree individual I have ever had the pleasure of knowing. I want this to be a cautionary tale for all of you out there. I am not writing off all psychedelics, but know that the NBOMe series does not have nearly the same safety profile as other psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin. If you do choose to do this drug, expect the unexpected and prepare for the worst. Please have a trip sitter there for you. If any drug was to be taken that evening, I should have been sober and trip sitting. I would not wish this experience on my worst enemy. My 4 sisters lost a brother, and my parents wept over their son's cold, lifeless body. Please be careful. It all started one night with 6,000 UG of 25I NBOMe, a novel designer drug of the substituted phenylethylamine class of drugs. I placed the 2 tabs under my tongue and started a timer for 30 minutes. The first effect I noticed was that the tabs had a sharp, bitter, and metallic taste to it. A few minutes after that, it started to numb my mouth to the point where my entire lower jaw was numb. At this point, I knew that I had a very high dose, but I never questioned whether that was dangerous. All I knew at the time was that it was fake LSD. Honestly, if I had the pharmacological knowledge then that I have now, I probably would have never had such an experience. When we reached our destination, I started having full visual effects in 25 minutes. It started with general breathing and distortions of my surroundings. Then I began having strange images from my past appear everywhere I looked. I recall this feeling to be my peak of my last trip, and given that only 30 minutes have passed now, I figured I was in for a long night. This is the point where the visuals and body load became heavy. A friend of ours, let's call him Jay, picked us up and drove us to a nearby playground where they were going to smoke and I was going to enjoy my trip. As we pulled away in the car, my time was so distorted that I thought we had all stretched like an object approaching a black hole and that everything in front looked like hyperspeed. When we got there, we got out and sat inside a small building on the playground. At this point, Jay had to run home really quick, and my other friends began smoking the weed we bought from our supplier. This is when the effects became overwhelming. My hearing was so distorted, it sounded like sound waves just coming and going constantly. There was no longer anything in my visual field that I could tell was actually real. My friends started to look like strangers to me. I started digging so deep into my subconscious that I began using terminology from my childhood. For example, my friends told me that Jay was coming back, and I responded by saying that we can't have a play date. This is where I began to enter delirium and psychosis. Suddenly, I realized that intelligence, law, and mental health were all their own things. Because I knew I had psychiatric issues, I felt that I was immune from everything else. This is when I saw myself in the corner of a padded room, wearing a straitjacket, and I saw myself living in that one moment, infinitely. When Jay returned, they were tired of watching my stupid self, so they took me back home. When they walked me up, I was apparently so loud that I woke my dad up, and when he came to the door, he asked what I had taken, and I yelled, "Acid!" even though it was far from that. This is where I lost all control and lucid thinking. Some energy started building up in me, and I felt this rush of motivation that I had solved the big question and had the key to the universe. At this point, I was walking back and forth muttering, "I need Riley, my ex-girlfriend, and a Bible. Riley and a Bible, Riley and a Bible," just over and over again, because those were the two missing pieces I needed to get the answer. At that point, my dad said that I started turning mildly blue and that it was time to go to the emergency room. It took a while to convince me to go anywhere because in my delusional mind, I had one goal and only one purpose. This was the end of the world. I had the key, and after I've told the world, I would die. When we walked into the waiting room, I was later told that I began to remove all my clothes and continue to preach to many people who were not actually there. They immediately took me in, and because I refused to let them take my temperature, it was inserted the other way. They also placed an IV in my arm, and I was elated, because in my mind, they were finally hooking me up to the universe supercomputer so that I could relay the key to the whole world. I saw myself rising up in my bed, and above me was this large orb that I could manipulate, feel, etc. That's when the strangest part happened. I left my body, plain and simple. I saw myself standing on top of the orb with all my friends around me, and I was telling them everything and my body was below me. I thought that I fulfilled my purpose and that I was dead and the world was protected. That's when they apparently put diazepam and lorazepam in my IV, and I felt myself being pulled back into my body, and then I remember waking up in the bed with mild visuals and intense amnesia. The nurse then came in and told me that my tox screen came back negative for everything. I was then told that my temperature was around 107, my heart rate was around 165, and my body was entering total organ failure, and that I was lucky I got brought in when I did. 25I NBOMe is a very potent and dangerous drug. Make sure you have real LSD, because it may just save your life.
The day of my first ever psychedelic experience, I was riding my bike down the streets of Lincoln Park in Chicago, and I got a call from my friend, who over the phone sounded more ecstatic and purely happy than I've ever heard anyone speak. He says he and his roommate scored LSD, and I should come over and trip with them. Having been curious about LSD ever since being introduced to and becoming familiar with cannabis, I thought this was the perfect opportunity. Even better, my friend lived just 2 stories beneath me in the same building. If anything went wrong, I thought, I could just go upstairs to my room. I made my way over and took a tab of blotter under my tongue, and was immediately stung by its harsh, unceasingly bitter aftertaste. After not really feeling anything for 5 to 10 minutes, I went over to the bathroom to brush my teeth and try to get rid of the awful aftertaste that was still lingering. At this point, I'll mention that I thought I had consumed LSD, as this is what I was told. I didn't learn until years later. It was in fact 25I NBOMe, which provided a bounty of context and relief for me following the experience that was just getting started. I'm in the bathroom, swishing water in my mouth, trying to get the awful taste out, and that's when I start to notice tiny little creases in the sink start to wiggle around like caterpillars. I was transfixed, and I couldn't believe such a visual hallucination could be so obviously real. I thought, oh boy, let's get started. As soon as I left the bathroom, however, after probably 10 minutes of observing the sink's wavy patterns, a deep wave of nausea came over me, to the point where I needed to take off my glasses and get on all fours just to get my bearings straight. I ended up vomiting pure water and bile, because I hadn't really eaten anything that day, and I was horrified to watch myself vomit liquid onto the ground that then immediately fluttered away as if it had wings. At this time, I began to experience deep pangs of anxiety and fear and confusion over why my vomit had seemingly flown away. Luckily, my roommate and my good friend happened to stop by to say hi, and as the only sober people in the apartment, they were a godsend, and my rock to this reality as I began to slip further down the rabbit hole. It should be mentioned that I have terrible eyesight without my glasses, and from this point on, putting my glasses back on would immediately shock my consciousness with an acute migraine, as if on command. It was just too much to see the world in normal vision for some reason, and I basically went the rest of the trip only seeing incredibly blurry shapes, light, and colors. I was deeply ashamed for my sober friends to see me like this, but also overwhelmingly grateful for their friendship and presence. My friend handed me a glass of water, which I needed to hold extremely close to my face in order to make it out properly. I managed to take a few drinks, after which I saw the glass of water melt into my grip and pool onto the ground like hot lava, except completely translucent. Freaked out by this apparent transformation, I dropped the glass I was holding and shattered it on the ground, and with this indescribably intense sound of the glass shattering on the wood floor, we entered full-on bad trip mode. Feelings of overwhelming, suffocating shame, fear, anxiety, disappointment, and self-hatred assaulted me from all sides. How could I do a drug like this? How could my friends see me like this? Somehow I got this innate sense all of my family members knew what I had just done, and all disapproved. I felt emotionally emancipated from every loved one in my life. These intense and terrifying thoughts were racing through my head, far too quickly to get a handle on any of them, long enough to actually verbalize. All I could do was sigh. If I could at least sigh, that was something. At this point, I basically lost all nerve function in my hips. I was sitting down on the ground near where I had puked up against the wall, and I physically couldn't stand up. It was like my brain forgot I had a pelvis. I could move my toes and legs, but I just couldn't figure out how to stand up at all, which intensified previous feelings of fear and anxiety by 100, and I immediately concluded I was losing my mind, and that this would be a permanent condition for the rest of my life. I attempted to motion to my friend that I wanted to take a shower. I was profusely sweating, malnourished, dehydrated, and freaking out, but I couldn't come close to articulating that. All I could muster was pathetically pleading for water. I need water, from that angle, while pointing up at the ceiling. My friend got me another glass of water. At this time, any semblance of time has gone completely out of the window. I don't know if this next part lasted 5 minutes or 5 hours, but all of my already blurry visuals began to take an ever-intensifying layers of hypnotically entrancing fractal patterns, to the point where it completely overwhelmed my sense of time and space, and there was just pure blackness. The depths of my abject terror and shame kept finding new lows, and it felt as if I was being supremely punished by a divine being for violating some core tenet of existence that I hadn't realized I had violated until it was too late. My brain's capacity to organize sensory input soon went completely haywire, and my consciousness brought forth so many different senses from my past experiences, all at once, that it's impossible to capture the full scope of feeling using human language. The best I've been able to describe it is, at one point, each one of my 10 fingers felt completely wrapped up in a different Chinese finger trap, and each of the 10 finger traps consisted of a wholly different texture, feeling, pressure, temperature, smell, and emotional supplement. My left thumb was wrapped in a tight rope of feeling a smooth stone at the bottom of a shallow pond, while my left index finger was wrapped in the feeling of getting too close to a hot oven. My left middle finger was wrapped in cold Cool Whip, and my left ring finger was unfortunately trapped in a blanket made of pure static electricity. Every single finger was like this, as were all of my toes. Interestingly, it felt like I was slowly sinking into dense mud or sand. I didn't realize it until later, but this was the moment I regained motor control. I was too sucked into the overwhelmingly scary torrent of glitched out sensory data from my past experiences being piled on top of my unceasing anxiety, nausea, and fear that this was it. I absolutely became convinced I was dying, and that this person I thought I was, with a first name and last name and social security number, was just a pathetic shadow of the failed dream that this dark, unaccountable energy couldn't turn into a functioning person. I crawled into a fetal position on my friend's couch, and unable to escape the distraction of my two neighbors, still having a fantastic time, not even worrying about me, because I had my two sober friends to babysit me. They graciously walked me up the 2 flights of stairs to my apartment. I was still in hell. I only have a vague memory of steps being progressed beneath my feet, but I was still without glasses, and without any sense or frame of reference to the normal, the world that my babysitting friends were still in. The only thing in all of existence that existed was my eternal shame and the eternal abject terror at the unrelenting consequences my misbehavior would wreak on me for the rest of my life. I was still sweating at this point, but also shivering at the same time. I ended up shirtless with a very light pair of shorts on, wrapping myself in a thick fleece blanket, as my two friends sat on either side of me, playing video games, with no volume on, as I just sat between them and attempted to let time ride this thing out. I still had enough sense of myself that I could tell a decent chunk of time had passed. I periodically tried putting my glasses on to see if I could avoid the instant migraine I suffered in the past. And once I could get my glasses on without feeling that intense wave of pain, I realized there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and that this thing would in fact end. I wasn't dead, and this was the point where I slowly, very gradually, began to come up, to the point where, after probably a solid hour of sitting between my friends playing, I got up and managed to make myself a basic hot dog with mustard and ketchup. Mind you, this is still the only real food I've had in like 12 to 15 hours, and the first bite immediately made me nauseous, and I gagged the food out of my mouth before I even had a chance to swallow it. 30 minutes later, I managed to hold down my first bite of food all day. A few other friends came over to cheer me up after hearing from my babysitting friends what had happened, and they were a further godsend that helped me come to grips with the normal world again. I probably took that one tab at 3 p.m. and wasn't able to finally lay down and go to sleep until 11 a.m. the next morning, at which point I was so thoroughly exhausted mentally and physically that it literally took me sweating the absolute last drop of the trip out of my face in order to finally fall asleep. It was easily the most terrifying and unexpectedly traumatizing day of my life, and I've been grappling with the consequences for years, struggling to integrate it into my life. Never before had I even considered the thought that I would need depression or anti-anxiety medication. Now I needed both, and weekly therapy, just to regain a sense of the person I was before this undescribably terrifying experience. When I was 18, a friend of mine got their hands on some 25I NBOMe and gave me 2 hits. The night I had decided to take them, I'd made some preparations beforehand, such as filling empty bottles with water in case I got thirsty. I had zero intention of walking downstairs to my kitchen for a glass of water while tripping on what is effectively acid. I also turned on the lava lamp and laser lights in my room to enhance the trip. Anyway, around 9 o'clock I put both hits against my gums. I didn't feel anything immediately, other than an unpleasant chemical taste. After being on my laptop for around half an hour, I could feel it start to kick in. As I put my laptop down, something caught my eye. My carpet was green and shaggy, and has very small woven knots on it. As I stared at the knots that it was made out of, it seemed to climb over each other, like waves crashing onto the shore of a beach. It was incredible. However, as I enjoyed watching the knots of my green carpet climb and roll over each other, they soon morphed into miniature creatures. They were dark, and had between 6 and 8 legs that crawled over each other. It looked as if the floor of my bedroom was an inch thick and disgusting insects. I could hear their legs tapping and clicking before a faint buzzing began to get louder in my ears. It was at this point everything started to go downhill, fast. I tried escaping my floor by getting onto my bed, but as I pulled back the blanket, I saw a mound of bugs underneath it, all of them suddenly scattering, crawling in all directions, as if I'd disturbed them in their hiding place. I fought the urge to scream, stomping and swatting in all directions, as I started to feel their tiny legs crawling up my body. They were everywhere. I could feel them in my hair and trying to crawl up my nose. Now, in full-blown panic, my heart was pounding in my head. I made my way to the shower to get the imaginary bugs off of me, but when I pulled the curtain back, I was face to face with a black, furry spider, the size of a dog. I will never forget its red eyes, or how tar poured from its fang-filled mouth. This was the single most scary experience of my life so far. This is where my memory of the night's events go fuzzy, but from what I've been told, I made quite a commotion when I was attempting to escape the bathroom, gaining the attention of my parents, who had been in bed at the time. Obviously, they could tell something was not right with me, and somehow my father was able to get me in the car and take me to the hospital. I woke up lying in a hospital bed. I remember watching the ceiling, which appeared to be breathing in and out. The room's air vent blew rainbow-colored bubbles out. Turns out, I shouldn't have done both hits at once. After being in the hospital for about 3 days, I was eventually discharged. While physically I recovered, the consequences of doing this drug didn't end there. I now have a form of delusional parasitosis and have to sleep with the lights on. My advice to anyone considering taking 25I NBOMe is don't.
I weighed up 20 milligrams and threw it in my mouth. No matter what I take, I usually let it sit in my mouth for a while just so it hits faster. Not sure if it's a mental thing or not, but it almost always works. It was a bit strange. I didn't remember 2CI having this taste. It was obviously a nasty chemical taste, but the bitterness was a bit more pronounced. It also had more of an odor to it. About 10 minutes later, I drank it down with a glass of water and snorted another 10 milligrams. I felt I was pretty tolerant to 2Cs, being as I had taken a few of them in the past in high doses. I knew I was in for a good trip, but not nearly the magnitude that would result. After I snorted the 10 milligrams, I noticed something strange, almost no burn in the nostril. For about 2 seconds, I thought, fuck, it's bunk, until I felt the psychedelic energy come over me. My entire vision soon was covered in fractals, and I was extremely stimulated. I quickly sat down in a chair and tried to play with a cat, but it didn't work too well. Couldn't even focus on a kitten. At this point, I began thinking that something fishy was going on. I decided to go for a walk, and this is where the trip began to lose linear structure. I walk out the door of the house I'm essentially squatting in, and the outdoors is incredibly blissful. Everything has a shimmering quality, and the leaves of trees are flowing into one another. It is about midday, and the sun is shining high in the sky. I walk a few blocks to a huge wooded park and enter the forest. I feel a bit cold, which is strange on a warm day. I lose myself in the greenery and the life of the forest. At one point, I find myself at the bank of a creek, watching the roots of the trees that are exposed intertwine with each other and the leaves around them. I climb on the exposed roots and lose all sense of being separate from them. I was the tree. I was its root, and it was my job to find and provide nutrients, water, and food for the entire interconnected forest. I felt at peace. I felt as if my niche with nature was finally intact, something I had searched for my entire life. Somewhere in this bliss, I realized that gaining water for the tree meant I needed water myself. I searched my immediate surroundings and I realized something horrible. I didn't bring any water with me. I thought I was on a large dose, but was really on an insane, maybe even lethal dose of a research chemical, and I hadn't brought any water when going on a multiple-mile walk. I quickly kneel down to the creek and drink out of it. It is gross water, but it fills me back up with life. I again feel wondrous and soon get lost in the psychedelic bliss. During this sustained amount of bliss, I take more and more gulps from the stream. My only recollection of reality was finding a stream and drinking from it numerous times from this nature walk. The rest is filled with seemingly coexisting peaceful moments with nature. At one point, I was in a tree, another in a hole in the ground covered in beetles and ants, and yet another rolling around in endless laughter and tall grass, along with countless others that only reappeared in my memory in dream or other mystical states. This forest was huge, so there wasn't much to be worried about in the aspect of people finding me. This might have been my downfall. My last glimpse of reality in the forest was walking on the paved trail and realizing I was about to leave the park. I realized there must be something wrong. My temperature is through the roof. I'm sweating beyond belief, and I put my hand up to my neck to feel my heart rate and relative blood pressure, and it is pounding at over 130 beats per minute. This strikes fear in me. I need to find water. I soon look around and find an old disgusting bottle of water that seems to have some plant life in it. I pour it over my head and drink some of it. It was my mission to make it back to the house without any break in reality. I knew at this point something was up with the drug I took. I thought to myself it probably wasn't 2CI, and then I suddenly realized that it felt nearly identical to 25I NBOMe. The feeling in my nostril of almost no burn, the immediate psychedelic slam of a higher magnitude than any other 2CI adventure in the past, and the dehydration and insane heart rate, it all added up. The walk home is something that escaped my memory. The next thing I remember is saying hello to my roommate and saying I needed to go to sleep. They each took 20 milligrams orally without holding it in their mouths, and I was worried about them to death, but I figured if I can make it with how much I took, that they could too. If I felt like I needed the hospital, I would tell them and they would come with me. They took much less than me. I figured I'd be the guide. I walked upstairs and tried to wait out my trip. This house did not have air conditioning, and soon I was lying on my bed in the most upstairs room with a wet washcloth, tossing and turning in my bed. My entire vision swarmed with psychedelic visions in a dream state, and I watched a snake devour my arm. I'm not sure what that was about. I was lost in myself. I had no sense of who I was. All I knew was that I was in trouble. This went on for hours, heart rate now above 140 beats per minute, and the temperature fluctuation was hell. From being extremely hot and my brain feeling like it's melting, to freezing and needing to be under 1,000 blankets. The mindset at this point was empty terror. That's the only way I can describe it, to be honest. I had no control over my emotions or thoughts. All I knew was that I was terrified to death. Then suddenly, I find myself on the couch downstairs, laughing with my roommates. I again check my heart rate, and it's at a healthy level, healthy compared to before, 110 beats per minute or so. I am thirsty, but I have a glass of water right next to me. I'm watching an underwater sea show, and I'm enjoying it immensely. One of my favorite metal bands, Meshuggah, is playing in the background, and my vision is swarming with fractal beauty. To this day, I don't know how I got down there, or if the whole adventure upstairs in my bed was just imaginary. My roommates were fine from the 20 milligrams they took orally. They just said they tripped hard with a massive thirst and a weird sensation of being warm. They tell me it's 10 p.m. and are coming down themselves. I realize I have been tripping for nearly 11 hours, and I'm still tripping at this point, extremely hard, but at least it's manageable. The remaining 3 or 4 hours of the trip we spent together, watching underwater sea life and listening to Meshuggah. At this point, it was quite enjoyable, and I was blown away that everything ended okay to the point of tears. I was unable to sleep that night because of lingering stimulation and emotional stress due to actually being alive. The next few months, I've had very strong HPPD. All patterns would move if I looked at them for too long. Lights were multicolored and usually took on a fractal pattern. Colors were extremely vibrant and sometimes mismatched. Certain pitches of sounds put me in a strange meditative headspace, and to this day, Dancers to a Discordant System by Meshuggah nearly makes me flashback. This was hell. I don't think you understand hell until you come this close to death. This drug isn't anything special. It's a stimulant with psychedelic visuals and some empathogenic effects. While the beginning and the end were somewhat enjoyable, the middle was a realm of existence I'd rather die than visit again. Just because I survived this doesn't mean you will. I truly believe even 1 milligram more could have killed me. During the moments of which I cannot decipher, I could have easily died from a heart attack or overheating. I will never order from a chemical vendor again unless I have the means to accurately test myself. People have died off of this drug from less than I have taken. I don't know the details, but it seems to be I am lucky to be alive. I'm sure the oral dose killed some of the bioactivity, but again, I did hold it in my mouth for 10 minutes. An average dose is around 500 UG. At 30 milligrams ingested, I took 60 hits. I always do an allergic reaction test with 1 to 3 milligrams with every drug I ordered, and for some reason, I didn't do it with this batch. It nearly cost me my life. This drug isn't worth the risk. The pretty visuals might make you happy, but they aren't something you can't see on other drugs. There is very little introspection, and the only positive thing I felt was a connection to nature, which I can get with meditation or even cannabis. Even if you dose it out correctly, there's much better drugs out there. All I can say is, buyer beware. Even the best sources in the world make mistakes. Even the most careful of users make mistakes. Stay safe, happy tripping, and never go into something if you're not sure what you're getting. Okay, let me start off by saying that I've tripped more than most can imagine. LSD 80 times, shrooms 20 plus times, 4-ACO DMT roughly 15 times, 2CE roughly 25 times, and also 25I NBOMe roughly 12 times. My wife and I got some 25C NBOMe to celebrate getting married. She has only done shrooms and LSD in her life. We took this substance 4 days before our wedding, so here is the horror story. Now take into account, I am admitting we were dumbasses, but I hope people take from this. At around 3:30 p.m., we both snorted roughly 3 milligrams each. I get up to go get the dishes done, so the house is nice and clean for our trip. She says she's going to get on the PC and see how long it takes to kick in. She opens the laptop, and I look at her from the kitchen, and she closes it right back up. I ask why you didn't look it up, and she says, I'm already tripping. I say no way, Mine hasn't kicked in. 2 minutes later, it does just that. It is now 3:37 and it is hitting hard. We walk out to the backyard and the visuals are so strong it's becoming hard to see her face from 5 feet away. I hear her say that she is scared and asks if she's gonna be okay. I say yes and try to smile at her, but my breathing is becoming more difficult and I am also scared, but I do not want her to know. It is now 3:40 and I help her off the steps to walk her back in and sit on the couch. She sits down and asks again if she will be okay. I ask, would you like me to call an ambulance? She is now so out of it, she doesn't really respond. 3:43 p.m. I grab my phone and call 911 and I ask for an ambulance and tell them me and my fiance had ingested a chemical called 25C NBOMe and it was becoming harder to breathe. 3:48 p.m. 5 cops come into my home and ask what's wrong. I try to explain to them that we are hallucinating and having trouble breathing and show them the package on the table along with some 25C that was sitting there that we didn't snort. They were having a hard time understanding what was going on. They've never heard of it. My fiance starts screaming at them to get her to the hospital. They tell her the ambulance is on the way. Not sure of the time now, but it hasn't been long. The next thing I remember is my fiance is on a stretcher and I'm walking out toward the ambulance. They have me step up on it and sit on the chair behind her on the stretcher. They put IVs into us both and start asking what we see. I try to say things are swirling and my fiance just keeps screaming to get her to the hospital. I have my head down with my eyes closed because I am terrified at this point. I hear them say to my fiance, "You better wake up now. We are putting a breathing tube down your throat." I look up and scream at her, "I love you." And she comes back too, still screaming why isn't she at the hospital. While we're on the ambulance, I hear a cop calling someone asking about 25C, and he says they recommend benzos to counteract. We get to the hospital, and they take her off to a room and walk me to a separate room. They hook me up to a lot of wires, and I am terrified. A cop walks in and says we are not pressing charges. I say great. I have a guy who is my nurse talking to me as he checks my wires and stuff, and I asked if my fiance is alive. He says yes. I ask if we were going to live. He said that both of our heart rates were over 200, but we have them going down now. Hours go along. I miss my fiance. After 7 hours, both vital signs are back to normal, and they release her about 20 minutes before me. She had called her sister a couple hours earlier to have company. They release us both, and her sister drives us home. We are lucky to be alive. I have done up to 8 milligrams of 25I NBOMe, and with 3 of the 25C NBOMe, my wife and I almost died. I will not trip again, but be safe if you do.